This video is about Augustine as a church leader, so I have a picture of him up wearing his bishop's hat because, of course, he was a bishop. Okay, Augustine was made a priest by Bishop Valerius of Hippo. Remember from Brown's biography of Augustine, Augustine did not want this. So why would a bishop force an ordination on someone? There's probably quite a few reasons why he made this choice, but Augustine's skills as a public speaker was certainly a major reason. Remember, Augustine was trained in rhetoric. He was a teacher. He was a persuasive public speaker. And as a priest, he could be compelled to use those skills to preach and defend the faith. Interestingly, we don't know much about preaching in North Africa before Augustine. We have 7 sermons from St. Cyprian that were saved, but otherwise, Augustine's sermons were the first saved from North Africa, or the first instances that we have. More than likely, other stuff was just destroyed in the Vandal invasions. We do know that prior to Augustine, only bishops in the area were allowed to preach, though he preached as a priest. And it does seem that the situation for the Catholic Church in North Africa was rather desperate at this time. There was a lack of competent clergy in the area. We know that Augustine avoided going to churches that had clergy and bishop vacancies because he was worried that he would be pressed into service. The situation seems really odd to us, though I have joked with people that we should try it again because we are dealing with clergy shortages once again in a variety of denominations. But anyway, I'll leave that be. And it is speculated that Catholic clergy shortages had a lot to do with the popularity of the Donatists compared to the Catholic Church in the area. So, if you consider this larger situation, this forced ordination of Augustine, while very coercive, makes some sense, at least like pragmatically. Augustine was a renowned orator. He was a teacher. He was a skilled writer. He was a lower C Catholic in his theology, and he was baptized by one of the most renowned bishops in the Roman Empire, Ambrose, who was well known for fighting against heretical ideas. And while the ordination was forced, like Ambrose before him, Augustine went to prepare for this new life that was forced upon him. All right. He spent time getting to know the Bible better. He worked to transform his general knowledge of the liberal arts into a more theological mindset. He composed a handbook for himself on Christian doctrine to help him. He wrote biblical commentaries to help himself write sermons. So even if he didn't want this job as a priest, as a bishop, he took it very seriously. Now, Augustine likely began preaching as soon as he was ordained a priest in the year 391, and he probably stopped preaching regularly in around 415 just due to age. He would have taught in a big basilica with a lot of people, and of course this is before microphones, so you needed a certain amount of strength just to project your voice. So anyway. He likely wrote about 4,000 sermons through his lifetime, 800 of which are known to us. So you might be asking yourself, was he a good preacher? The short answer is yes, he was. He was a good preacher. He was a good debater. He was a good speaker in general. But there's a really interesting story I came across that he writes about. He's at church and he had prepared a sermon on a particular psalm. And the lector that day read the wrong psalm. And instead of correcting the lector and having him read the correct one, Augustine simply improvised and preached a sermon on the psalm that was read. And shockingly, the text of the sermon isn't noticeably different from ones that he had prepared for. All right. And he tells this story to emphasize the importance of being able to improvise when you are a preacher. All right. Augustine's style seems to have been influenced by Cicero, who of course was not a Christian. He was an orator, but then Augustine adapts this to suit his own task as a Christian preacher. Augustine considered the 3 tasks of the preacher to be to teach, to delight, and to sway or to move. All right. And these tasks built upon each other. They seem like pretty good advice even today. All right. So Augustine as a preacher, all right, very prolific, good at it. Augustine as an administrator is actually kind of interesting. Of course, preacher is not the only task of a bishop. Like every bishop throughout time, Augustine was forced to handle administrative tasks. I find it somewhat amusing, but not surprising. Augustine expressed deep concern for his parishioners, for their salvation, for their moral welfare, and he put great emphasis into that. He took that role very, very seriously. However, regarding administrative duties, he wrote and spoke of them rarely and mainly to express irritation at them. He had virtually no interest in financial oversight of his episcopal see. Instead, he delegated tasks like this to clergy who likely were more skilled at it. Honestly, Augustine doesn't seem like he would be great at these types of things. Though I do want to note that although money didn't interest him, and he was somewhat of like a communist in his own beliefs, that he was rather shrewd in property management. So even if Augustine didn't want to deal with the money aspect, there were aspects of his administration that kept him really, really busy. And the first one is probably the thing that took the most of his time, and he took it very seriously, though I think he did view it as a burden, and that was his hearing of court cases. He heard a variety of things here, often cases where fights over inheritances, but he also would hear cases about assault, about kidnapping. In one instance, he was dealing with slavers who were kidnapping people. Obviously, court cases are not something that bishops do anymore, but this was something, it was like every Monday he would deal with court cases, and likely he did more than that as well. And he did consistently show care in trying to make fair and just decisions in this process. He was also responsible for the other priests or the presbyters within his diocese. There is a somewhat well-known instance in which he's involved in a court case involving one of his own priests. Priests were not supposed to hold wealth, but this one had retained his property, supposedly in trust for his daughter. And when he died, he actually willed the property to the church and not to his own daughter. So Augustine sort of had to deal with this inheritance mess. Augustine ruled in favor of the daughter, and then went on and preached some sermons about it, likely trying to hold his clergy to the principles of their office. And this is something you see with him as well, which I'm sure was kind of a headache for him, was trying to get his clergy kind of to this sort of level of competence and moral authority that he didn't necessarily see them exhibiting. All right. So that's just a few of his tasks. So kind of the short of it, he really, really cared about kind of the moral and spiritual care for his flock. And then these other administrative duties were of varying interest to him, depending on what they were. All right. That's all I have for you now. Thanks, everybody.